Join me as I take you for a trip around the world in a little more than 8 minutes, as we analyze, evaluate, and enjoy the beloved classic Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. We begin in France, Nantes, France, a bustling port city where on February 8, 1828, Jules Verne was born. Its busy port, with ships always coming and going, made Verne at an early age begin thinking and dreaming about adventure and travel. Moving on to Paris, we see Verne studying law at the request of his father, but falling in love with literature and the theater. He wrote several plays in the 1850s and then quit his current job as a broker when he met Pierre-Jules Hetzel in 1862, who was to become his lifelong publisher and friend. Then for the rest of his life, and continuing after, Verne's works of science fiction were published to the delight of many readers. He produced more than 60 novels in his series Voyages Extraordinaires, of which are Around the World in 80 Days is a part. Now we travel to London, where we find our book set, in the year 1872, which was 1 year before the book was published. There we find an eccentric but exceedingly precise man named Phileas Fogg, who never does anything unexpected, and his newly hired, easily upset, energetic French servant, Passepartout. Phileas Fogg makes a bet with some of his colleagues that he can travel around the entire world in 80 days. I bet £20,000 against anyone that I will go around the world in 80 days or less. In other words, 1920 hours, or 115,200 minutes. His colleagues accept this bet, thinking that it would be impossible to complete such a journey in just 80 days. That very night, Phileas Fogg and a very shocked Passepartout set out on their journey. It would take much too long to tell all the adventures Phileas Fogg and his servant had on their trip around the world, all the while being followed by Fix, a police inspector who thinks Fogg has committed the recent robbery of £55,000 from the London bank. They traveled from London to Suez, to Bombay, to Calcutta, to Hong Kong, to Yokohama, to San Francisco, to New York, and back to London, with a few unplanned stops on the way. Throughout the trip, he used, quote, steamships, railways, carriages, yachts, commercial vessels, a sledge, and an elephant, unquote. After spending a huge amount of money and causing a lot of disturbance, Phileas Fogg arrives back in London 5 minutes late. Quote, after completing his journey around the world, Phileas Fogg had arrived 5 minutes late, unquote. That is, until it is realized that since they traveled around the world from east to west, they had crossed the international date line and had arrived 1 day early. And Phileas Fogg wins his bet for traveling around the world in 80 days. Arriving back in London, let us begin to look into the technicalities and literary devices within the novel itself. The book has a few genres into which it can fit. The first obviously being a novel, which is a book of considerable length with quite a few main characters. The second genre is adventure. The novel consists of a story that is outside of the ordinary in Phileas Fogg's life. Therefore, it falls into this category, along with the fact that it is highly adventurous, as we would call it. The mode of this book is mainly realistic, as it focuses on the reality of time and the restraints it has on people, while there is almost no mention of the supernatural. It focuses on people in the middle class and gives the impression that you are seeing the events unfolding through the lens of a camera. All of these aspects of the realistic mode. As far as topics in Around the World in 80 Days, Verne chooses to write about things that had interested him since his childhood, travel and adventure. Other topics include racing against time, betting, and duty. Let us now travel on to the book's themes. The biggest theme in the novel is time. Time is of the essence in order for Fogg to complete his journey, and we see that time is fickle and does not favor or stop for anyone. The only reason that Fogg is able to complete his journey is because of a hiccup in time, the international dateline. In this book, Verne is trying to tell us not to waste time, because even an extremely punctual and precise man like Phileas Fogg is not able to control or predict it. The next theme is that happiness is most important. While on his journey, Mr. Fogg saves a young woman in India from being burned alive with her dead husband in a ceremony called a sutti. The woman, named Aouda, travels around the rest of the world with Fogg and Passepartout, and at the close of the book, Fogg and Aouda marry. So, what does all this have to do with the theme that happiness is most important? That is best illustrated with a quote that comprises the last lines of the book. What had he gained from all this travel? What had the journey brought him? Nothing, it could be said. Nothing, that is, except for a charming wife, who, however unlikely it may seem, made him the happiest of men. In all truth, isn't this more than enough reward for going around the world? We see here that Verne values happiness hugely, as displayed through his comments of Fogg only gaining happiness from his trip around the world. Continuing on our journey, we arrive at Fogg's experiment in living. As has already been stated, Fogg bets his colleagues £20,000 that he can travel around the world in 80 days. His experiment is successful only because he crossed the international date line. By going eastwards, Phileas Fogg had seen the sun cross the meridian 80 times, whereas his colleagues back in London had only seen it cross 79 times. In keeping with Fogg's unchangeable character, his experiment in living does not change either, but he keeps on through every difficulty, from buying and riding an elephant across the Indian jungle to ripping apart the wooden deck of a ship and putting the wood into the ship instead of coal. Phileas Fogg was not going to be thwarted in his endeavor. It is mainly through this experiment in living that Verne conveys his central theme of time being fickle. For despite Fogg's perfect calculations on his journey, he is still subject to time's whims. Our last stop on our journey is that of characterization, particularly of Phileas Fogg and his servant Passepartout. First, comparing Verne's use of direct versus indirect characterization. You will see that he uses a mixture of both, with direct characterization heavier towards the beginning of the book, and indirect towards the end. Verne usually tells us what a character looks like through direct characterization. People compared him, Fogg, to Byron because of his good looks, certainly not because of a limp, but a Byron with a mustache and whiskers, an impassive-looking Byron, who could have lived for 1,000 years without showing signs of age. But he lets the reader discover the nature of the character through their actions and experiments in living. Now to assess the two characters stated earlier. We begin with Fogg. Phileas Fogg is the protagonist of the story and is a sympathetic and complex character. His personality is one of an eccentric and impassive gentleman, never wasting time and never deviating from his usual ongoings, that is, until he embarks on his journey. But throughout the book, Fogg's impassiveness remains. He is never upset or worries even when it seems they have encountered a delay that will keep them from being back in London on time. When they have missed the ship that will take them across the Pacific, and Fogg's servant Passepartout is missing, Verne says that there was no sign of disappointment on his, Fogg's, face, and when Mrs. Aouda looked up at him anxiously, he merely replied, "It's just a minor problem, madam, nothing more." Again, when Fogg is in danger of missing another ship and losing his bet, Verne says, "Mr. Fogg was impassive, and yet his whole future was at stake at that very moment." Passepartout, Fogg's French servant, is like Fogg, in that he is also a main, sympathetic, and complex character. He also changes throughout the book, making him a dynamic character. But in sharp contrast to Fogg, Passepartout is easily distressed and worried. He is also very unpredictable and sometimes foolish. In fact, Fogg and Passepartout are so different that they are foiled, meaning that the two characters are contrasted to display differences. Verne contrasts them throughout the entire novel, as is seen in this quote. Passepartout felt completely devastated. To have missed the steamer across the Pacific by 45 minutes was a terrible blow for him. It was all his fault. Instead of helping his master, all he'd done was keep putting obstacles in his way. He was furious with himself. Mr. Fogg, however, made no criticism of him, and he merely said, "We shall decide what to do tomorrow. Come along." Usually, in a character foil, an author will display one character as better than the other, but in Around the World in 80 Days, Verne seems to emphasize his theme that time is fickle by making neither Fogg nor Passepartout better than the other. For although the men are extremely different, time affects them both, and neither can avoid its consequences. I hope that you have enjoyed this journey and that it has enlightened you to the themes and literary devices Jules Verne uses in his novel Around the World in 80 Days. I would like to tell you more about this wonderful book, but time is fickle and mine is running short. Thank you for joining me for this trip around the world in a little more than 8 minutes. I live in beautiful, sunny Southern California, about 8 miles from the beach. My interests include photography, anything having to do with the ocean or the sea, hanging out at Disneyland, backpacking, yes, this is a picture of me, volleyball, horseback riding, and theater. I am a 16-year-old junior in high school, and I plan to study writing and journalism at a currently unknown university. I hope you have enjoyed my presentation. Thank you for listening.